Hi, everybody. Ian Bremmer here, and a quick take on the U.S.-Canada relationship, which right now is on ice. And I don't mean the hockey kind. Trump, the tariff man, cometh some 25% across the board on Canada, on Mexico too, except on Canadian oil. That's only 10%. Why? Why 10% on oil? Because that's actually what makes up Canada's surplus with the United States. So wouldn't you actually hit that sector harder if you were trying to balance the budget? And the answer is, of course, no. That's like saying Canada's a friend and China's an enemy. And so wouldn't you hit the Chinese harder than the Canadians? Instead of the Chinese only 10%, and the Canadians 25%, Mexico 25%. But that's also not the case. Why? Because China can cause a lot more damage to the United States. And so therefore, President Trump has to be more careful. Canada, Mexico, a lot smaller, much easier to punch down against the Canadians, even if it's technically punching up, given where they sit geographically. And except for oil, where the United States gets 4 million barrels a day, which is much more than the U.S. gets from the rest of the world combined. And that quality of crude, only replaceable in terms of the kind of crude it is from Venezuela, with massive sanctions and run by a dictator, and they've destroyed much of their own oil sector. So that's not a capability, which means that the Canadians can't send it anywhere else. The Americans can't buy it anywhere else, but the U.S. is more powerful, so Trump thinks he can get away with it. So why? If it's not about oil, and it's not really about the trade surplus, then why is it that Trump is doing this? And what he says is it's about fentanyl and illegal migrants, that the Canadians are not policing their border. Again, doesn't make a lot of sense. Makes more sense for Mexico. And again, there's a big question about whether the smartest thing to do is, shoot first and ask questions later, or negotiate credibly first and not undermine the economies, the much weaker economies of your friends. But when it comes to Canada, the argument doesn't make sense at all. Fentanyl, we're talking about, on average, every year, about 10 kilos of fentanyl that is interdicted at the border, which is, by the way, that's every year from Canada. That's less than what you see in Mexico every day. So it's way under 1% of the total. Illegal migrants, it's a larger problem from Canada. Here you're talking about roughly 5% of the interdictions on the northern border of illegals coming into the United States, compared to 80% from Mexico, and the remainder mostly by sea and occasional air transit. And yes, I'm talking about what is being stopped, not what's getting through, which you can't measure as easily. But it's not like Homeland Security isn't tracking where illegal migrants are actually coming from. And this is not anywhere close to the issue from Canada than it is from Mexico. But that's not really the issue here either, because national security issues are more likely to hold up as legal reasons for the U.S. president to invoke IEPA, the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. And so, if you're worried that the court's going to strike down your tariffs because you don't actually have the law behind you, this is the way you couch it. And also, Trump doesn't really care what arguments he's using. It's to show that he can, and to get his supporters to go with him to make better deals for the U.S. no matter what. But the timing here is strategically horrible for Trump. Canada is at the beginning of an election, and this from Trump is remarkably unifying for the Canadians, using fake news to justify a trade war, and then leaning in to say that Canada can join as a 51st state if they want. Now, there are plenty of Canadians that over the last 8 years have supported Trump. Remember the truckers' strike, for example. I certainly see it and I hear it on my trips there. But these are not America First Canadians. These are Canada First Canadians. And they don't want the Canadians to fold to Trump. In fact, the only people that I hear saying quietly that they wish the Canadians would fold are the globalists. They're the corporate and financial elites in Canada that just really want this to go away because it's hurting their profits. And they're trying to find a way to say, well, just give them a win, it'll be okay. But I mean, in terms of the average Canadian, no, 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 no. They want their political leaders, whether it's the Conservative Party or the Liberal Party, to stand up to Trump. And that's why you've seen in the last 24 hours, Liberal leaders, whether it's Trudeau or it's Chrystia Freeland or Mark Carney, who are the two that are contesting for the premiership, or it's Pierre Poilievre, leading the Conservative Party, or Doug Ford, head of Ontario, who's also a major conservative leader in Canada. And they're all saying the same thing, which is they've got to stand up for Canada to hit Trump back hard, that they can't take this laying down. And these are also the people that are booing the U.S. national anthem at hockey games across the country in Canada right now, which I have not seen happen in Canada, frankly, since the U.S. war in Iraq. And I am not someone who opposes tariffs as a matter of course. I think the tariffs can be a useful tool of economic and national security influence. They can help to deal with national security concerns. They can help nudge rebalancing of economies for domestic reasons that matter politically. And we saw some of that during Trump's first term. We saw some of that during Biden's term. But for Trump's first term, he then had strong economic voices internally that were also moderating his behavior, that stopped fights from becoming long-term destructive. People like Robert Lighthizer, who was the U.S. trade rep, Jared Kushner, who was a senior advisor, had a lot of access and influence, of course, to his father-in-law, Steve Mnuchin, the Secretary of Treasury. That's not remotely the case this time around. That's not what you're seeing from Treasury Secretary Bessent or from Commerce Secretary Lutnick. Much, much weaker, much more divided forces internally. So instead, you are taking on America's closest friend, most trusted ally, not to mention critically integrated economy with the United States, and you are hitting them in the teeth harder than you are hitting anyone else. And I would argue that this is a big mistake long-term for the United States, and frankly, for everyone but America's adversaries who will take advantage of weakness of U.S. allies that have been historically very strong and that have been harder for adversaries to deal with. So, I mean, what is it that the United States stands for? And, you know, I go back, I think when I was a kid and when I was, you know, starting my studies, 1989, wall comes down. And, you know, around the world, people saw that, and they weren't all pro-American, not by a long stretch, but they would still say that the United States had values, that it was trying to stand for freedom and liberty and a free market economy, not always consistently, but nonetheless a general sense that that was something that the United States wanted to be seen as promoting. And today, you go to Canada, or you go to Denmark, or you go to Panama, or you go to Japan or South Korea, the European Union, you name it, and you ask people what America stands for, and they say power, and they say money, and they specifically say pay for play. And that is penny wise and pound foolish for the United States. And I don't know how U.S.-Canada is going to ultimately resolve itself. I don't think it's going to be resolved quickly. I think there will be a lot of economic pain on both sides, a lot more for the Canadians than the Americans because they're in a weaker position. But sooner or later, I think economic interests on both sides will lead to a deal. And I expect, I mean, this is not going to lead to a permanent trade war between the Americans and the Canadians, but you would have to go back to pre-war times to find a major country doing more than the U.S. is doing right now and President Trump is doing right now to undermine America's closest alliances. That is what's happening here. And I think long-term, this is really not in the interests of the United States, in the interest of the American people, and it's certainly not in the interest of having a sustainable and stable world. So that's it for me. I'll talk to y'all real soon, and be good.